The Hidden Dungeon Only I Can Enter is a modern fantasy anime that implements video game mechanics into it, but is not actually an isekai. See, people in this universe have various skills, and there's also a country that is organized based on noble titles. And at no point in this show, I think, do we ever see an actual commoner, but the main character is the child of a baronet, which is, both in real life and in the anime itself, the lowest possible noble title. He might as well have just been a commoner, though, because at one point he literally can't buy property because his noble rank is too low, which, what's even the point of being any sort of noble? Like, baronet in real life is sort of the shittiest noble rank, but it's still technically a noble rank. So I think the universe just wants him to start off really low, and I have no idea why they didn't just make him a commoner. Anyway, he has the ability Great Sage, which lets him ask and get information about basically anything in the universe. However, the drawback is that he gets a really bad fucking headache every time he does it, like a true migraine. So the ability was basically useless until the very start of the story, where he ends up getting kicked out of his bookstore job and has to go to like Hero Academy, and his best friend, who is a higher ranked noble than him, brings up the idea that she recently learned that the previous person with that ability would make out with his wives every time he tried to use the ability, which was supposed to alleviate the headache. And so he ends up making out with his best friend to use the ability to find out how he could become stronger to go to Hero Academy. And then he finds a dungeon called the Hidden Dungeon Only I Can Enter. And that is the name of the dungeon, and is a very poorly named dungeon, because not only can more than he enter, but he isn't even the first person in the building. In fact, when he enters the dungeon, there were other adventurers actively in the dungeon. So, despite the name, it really is just sort of the name of the dungeon. He even brings other people into the dungeon later on. So, yeah, it really is just sort of the name of the dungeon. Anyway, one of the notable people he finds in the dungeon is an absolutely legendary adventurer who basically got trapped there. And she ends up giving him her abilities, which include the ability to create new skills, edit previously existing skills, and then bestow skills onto other objects and people, which she probably used in order to give him those 3 skills, because they don't say she loses those skills. They also don't say that if you use the bestowal skill, you lose the skill, but he bestows a lot of skills onto things throughout the course of the show, and I don't think he loses them. The show is unclear about this. I like to imagine she still has her powers. Anyway, she's been trapped there for the past 200 years. So she gives him her powers and ends up teaching him how to use those abilities to become even stronger. So you'd think the ability to know anything in the universe would be like his big ability. Nope, it's the ability to make whatever power he has. Now, in the show's defense, it actually balances this better than you'd expect, because he has to use what's known as LP in order to activate the ability to create powers or edit powers. Not to bestow them, I don't think. But in order to create more LP, he basically just has to be a hedonist. So he has to eat like delicious food, have fun experiences, and participate in erotic scenarios. This is an ecchi series. Most of the time he's generating LP, it's through ecchi scenarios. Although I will say, again, in the show's defense, it isn't as overt into it as you'd expect. The show very rarely ever grinds to a halt. Usually it's done in service of something. So I will give the show credit for that. It's surprisingly tasteful in the way it does it. Not the most tasteful thing you've ever seen. It's not like Lemnir or whatever, but it is more tasteful than you'd expect from an ecchi anime fantasy. Anyway, he basically uses that to progress in life, fix his family's poor situation, and meet and help people. One of the girls that he meets, for example, is like dying of a curse. And I will say that the fact that he has to generate LP through hedonistic life choices actually manages to make this, even though it is a bit of a power fantasy, it puts a strong cap on what he can and can't do. Because the cost of like just curing the girl was too much. So they had to go find a cleric, but then the cleric had other problems. So then they had to solve the problems of the cleric. So he ends up having to go on quests because the inherent limitations of the power system make it so that he is incapable of just solving everything magically with the snap of his fingers, like so many other lesser series would have happened. And again, to the show's credit, One thing that I was certainly not expecting to be solved in season 1 was the fact that his mentor who taught him and gave him all these powers has been trapped in the dungeon for 200 years. And at the end of the show, in the last 2 episodes, he's like, I'm going to fucking rescue you. And she's like, don't do that. That's dangerous. And he's like, guess what? I'm going to do it. And yeah, the last 2 episodes are actually dedicated to doing that. And I think that speaks a lot to his character. Realistically, the plot lines in this aren't anything too in-depth, but the way the power system is handled and the scenarios the characters find themselves in manages to be charming and limited in such a way that the characters are capable of feeling challenges, which you would assume is the bare minimum for a story, but I have seen so many shitty fantasy anime not even be able to hit that bare standard. And the amount of charming situations the characters get into, one of which felt like it was about to get really uncomfortable before managing to actually pull itself out of there, and the interactions that the characters have with the main character, in that he actually genuinely cares for his harem girls, especially his childhood friend, which is practically the main love interest with how much time he spends with her throughout this. It ends up giving this sort of endearment to the character. And the main character, to his credit, is not as boring as one might expect. He's a little bit of an asshole, but not so much that he's an unlikable character. So he doesn't swing so far into the category of being one of those goody two-shoes characters without swinging too far in the opposite direction of becoming an irredeemable bastard. So the characters, their interactions, and the scenarios are simple, but well enough handled and entertaining enough to be a sort of charming and surprisingly watchable, competent fantasy anime. Twitch and Discord in the description. I've been Sacrobolic. You're Envoy of Hope. Bye-bye.